Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started on this video. This is going to be part 3 of the series on Marxism, idealism, the development of historical materialism, and what I felt were the flaws. The first couple of videos that I did posted last couple of weeks were on. The first one was on the ideology of the Marxist ideology and the people's like objections to specific arguments against it, and usually are revolving around people, accusing Engels of deviating from Marx or Marx deviating from whatever. And the second video was pretty much on um, the same topic basically, but got a little bit more into Hegel's idealism and how he defined it. But the third video was going to be me going through, because in the second video I went through, basically Marx and Engels. I think Lenin maybe I touched on, but the third was going to be like the deviation after that. So I was going to get into maybe like Mao or some other, Pan-Africanist, Marxist thinkers like Nkrumah or Walter Rodney or maybe Kwame Ture or people like that, or just in general post-Marx. But it ended up being just because I already recorded it, it ended up being more of a rant just on the specific Marxists after that. So I didn't really want to rant and basically repeat basically the same point. And it was pretty much the same point as I made in the first couple of videos, which was there was one basic fundamental flaw, and you really don't have to I didn't really have to keep going on and on, and do like another hour video just on that. So I'm just going to repeat that here. So just kind of like to summarize and kind of get like the main point, and then I'll move on to what I want to discuss in this video. So the main point to be made really is that when Hegel defined idealism, he defined it such that he didn't see any opposition of significance between idealism and realism. Like idealistic and realistic philosophies had no significance. And then basically what Marx did was reintroduce that significance. And obviously, this was an era that already had happened in philosophy once realist philosophers. When you look at like Locke, the tradition that followed like John Locke, some people might want to go like Francis Bacon or something a little bit before that, but it was really Locke, and then Hume had their ideas, you would say, that influenced a particular way of thinking, and that ended up influencing Kant to do his critique of pure reason in defense of rationalism and metaphysics. And Hegel kind of brought that back around to alignment to show where the deviation was made in between splitting those up to begin with. But then Marx comes back and basically re-ups the situation by then making, by boldly, going against idealism, but really he was going against materialism, but he made the distinction again between idealism in order to do so. And he ends up going against other materialists. And then what ended up happening over time is that because of the way Marx did it, defining it as certain aspects as idealism, which he really used the term abstract materialism. That's the one that was used in Das Kapital in the footnote about making the distinction. But he obviously, when he was critiquing Feuerbach, for example, he did use said one part was taken up in an idealistic fashion. He probably shouldn't have used that language, but because technically what Marx did was the historic part and the dialectic part came from idealism, and he was applying that against people who were also materialists. But the way that it ended up getting framed historically was as a consequence of a split between idealism and realism that didn't exist, or materialism that didn't exist within Hegel philosophy. So that was kind of the key point, and that kind of like everybody after that who weren't really like really in-depth philosophers made that error. But in this video, what I want to discuss, this should be pretty simple. I'm hoping to get through this. And if I do make a part 4 or 5, just depending on how many more topics I want to cover, in those I will probably maybe discuss the controlled opposition that capitalists were able to utilize and splitting. I would say, if you want to say, I don't want to say the working class, but in splitting the population, the general population, Western countries up between, like, fascism, for example, was a huge movement, obviously in Europe. And then you had certain reactionary movements that kind of get labeled as fascism that go along the same nationalistic, racist, anti-communist, pro-capitalist, or whatever you want to say, vibes or whatever in the U.S. So there's that, and then there's obviously bourgeois socialism, democratic socialism also has this anti-communist element. So I might discuss that in a video, but maybe not. And if I don't know if there's any other topics that I might want to think about discussing or not. But in this one, what I want to discuss is specifically class, because the way that Marx defined class, or the way that he was looking at class specifically in Das Kapital, in order to basically simplify into and simplify capital as a social relation into something that could easily be understood, like as a simplification would you could make between, like you say, master and slave, between capitalist and proletarian, bourgeois and proletarian. That easy type of dichotomy, kind of the dual, easy to understand, framework that could easily define capitalism just as a specific ideological point, as a specific, if you want to say, social relation, basically, in society. But obviously that's not how capitalism even works. Capitalism is way more dynamic than that. Obviously, starting out, slavery was a part. Obviously, feudalism still existed. There was aristocracy. There was, so many different elements, other than just that simplification of, wage laborers. So, and obviously what the meaning of proletariat originally, to mean like low class, obviously was supposed to denote, obviously, not simplification, to low class, but obviously you had slaves in the United States. So it, that obviously capitalism obviously never worked like that. That was just his simplification to be able to explain it in its purity for theoretical purposes, and for a bit greater explanation for people to be able to understand it. But if you actually understand the dynamics of capitalism, you actually understand the class dynamics are also that dynamic. So I want to discuss basically some of the dynamics of class, to kind of get away from what people do when they say working class, because this is another, error in Marxism, because of Marxist simplification of it, which, he had to do theoretically to describe it. But because of that simplification, people take working class as to be like one, grand thing. And like basically, like a 99% you usually get, or like, the working class overall versus, and I don't think that's a very accurate way. And I don't feel like it's a good, like a useful way for, the purposes of shaping, a revolution, or shaping, ideology such that, it becomes more socialistic, communistic, in order to overthrow capitalism, or to get people to revolt against capitalism, or however you want to frame it. So let me get into this first. This is 10 facts about the American worker. And basically the point that I want to make, it's just obvious. This is obvious. So it's nothing I really need to even explain. There's nothing really to disagree with. There's nothing controversial. It's just that if you look at the way that capitalism developed in the United States specific, I want to talk to the United States specifically because that's where I'm from the United States. So I live in the United States, and I'm talking the United States specifically for movements in the United States, and demographics in the United States. So, obviously, if you're from somewhere else and this isn't that interests you, that doesn't bother me. We could do it globally. Another video could be done globally. Someone else could do a video on globally. But this I want to focus on the United States because that's the context with which most people speak. About this, relevant to me. So what the basic point is that over time, if you look at, say, the end of the Civil War, Second Industrial Revolution, or you could even look before that, the founding of the country, the colonial times, to into the 20th century and across the 20th century, what happened was a reshaping of class in the United States, and a divide, ideologically between elements of class, and classes within classes that developed in the United States that sort of has to be dealt with before you can move forward into any type of consciousness, class consciousness, or class unity, or class war, against the bourgeoisie ruling class, right? Because there might be a ruling class, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who's petty bourgeois or everybody who's just in the lower part of the bourgeoisie doesn't exist. The bourgeoisie is the middle class. So just because everybody in the bourgeoisie is not ruling class doesn't necessarily mean that they're not bourgeois. And just because someone is bourgeois, this is an obvious point that people make all the time, just because someone is bourgeois, like maybe like an Engels or a Marx, doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be anti-capitalist. But obviously, if you're not even like looking at any of the bourgeois elements and trying to differentiate, you're going to have an issue with strategies and how to go about converting people over to your ideological points and getting people to be able to articulate and understand the issues a particular way. And that's why I said I might do the video on the controlled opposition, because that's obviously what capitalists were able to understand and do, was able to understand the elements of how we can control society through, income distributions, how we can control society through ideological distribution, and educational systems, and just like reinforcement of particular, through particular industries and jobs that we're able to utilize in the United States to put people in positions in defense of capitalism, and to basically reproduce the ideological structure and reproduce the social relation of capital by controlling the population. And obviously, in this, it just goes like this one says, over the past let me go and blow this up a little bit. Okay, so over the past 35 years, the share of American workers, this is Pew Research, so this is just basic points. Over the past 35 years, the share of American workers who belong to labor unions have fell. Obviously, what capitalists learned very early on, and this is my problem with labor unions in general, is if you have a union, one of the primary goals of the union is to improve workers, specific to that union, like livelihoods, basically, right? But they're not specific to that union, it's specific to that group of people. So just because you have a union doesn't mean the union is necessarily going to be proletarian in nature, right? And just because you have even one that's proletarian in nature, it doesn't mean that they're not going to get particular benefits and become bourgeois aspirational over time. That doesn't mean that they're going to be able to sustain even their union, right? And capital was able to understand that, and it's fundamentally reformist in its nature, right? Because the purpose of unions is to be able to reform capital such that workers gain more power and leverage under capitalism. But obviously, capital is not going to just be like, oh, okay, so they're going to try to destroy unions. They're going to try to fight unions to just prevent those basic benefits. But even if they grant those basic benefits, they're going to grant those basic benefits and then try to reshape and reframe that structure to reproduce capitalism. They're not going to try to just allow it to grow. And then over time, once the ideology, the proletarian kind of force of the union dissipates because they become more bourgeois through higher incomes, through more access to education, through their children then becoming educated and entering different fields. Eventually, over time, improved life quality and stuff like that, vacations and stuff, just to improve their lives over time, you could start chipping away. And then you could start the, right to work stuff. You could start the anti-union stuff. You could start the stuff where people feel more comfortable. And then obviously, there's other elements, but over time, you're going to get this, right? You're going to get lower participation in unions. You're going to get people opposing unions. You're going to get unions busted up. You're going to get capitalists winning this fight, right, over time. So the American generally like unions and probably support the right of workers to unionize, obviously, right? But that doesn't really matter in practice because they don't have ruling class say. So whatever you think is going to be completely different to how things actually, operate, right? And obviously, if you could get a large percentage of workers opposed to even, because it says Americans generally like unions and broadly right workers to unionize. So manufacturer workers, you have still have a percentage that say no. And why would there be any percentage of people within this who say no? Obviously, because you have capitalistic elements within this. Most American workers are employed in the service sector, and this is my main point, right? And obviously, you could see as it becomes more public related and service sector related, this grows, right? So manufacturing and factory workers have the highest percentage of ability and want to unionize, right? And this goes up almost by 10%, even by the time you get to police, and then by the time you get to school teachers, and by the time you get to fast food workers and stuff like that. You see. So this is going to be a major point as well, right? So most American workers are employed in the service sector, right? And this is kind of the main point that I want to get at too, is that there was a deterioration over time. And one of the last point I'm probably going to actually discuss, but probably the main core point is poverty, right? Because proletarian means low caste means poor. If these people get pulled into the middle class, then their ideology is going to be able to change a lot more as well, right? But even like I said with this earlier, to go back to the union thing, even if the American generally support unionizing, doesn't mean they necessarily support unionizing for the purpose of overthrowing capitalism and worker empowerment to then organize and then be able to take on these corporations. They probably support unionizing specifically to get higher incomes, to get more benefits, to get health care, to get basically more. They're bourgeois aspirational, right? They're bourgeois aspirational. They want middle class benefits. They don't want to overthrow capitalism, right? Or that could be a factor. I'm not saying that everybody, I don't know how that splits because I'm not going to go dig into that detail right now, but that's a factor. But most workers, as it says here, starting whenever this is going to be, are going to be service sector. They're not going to be productive. And obviously, if you read Marx, obviously he talks about productive capital a lot, because the point of that is that when you're in control of the production of actual wealth, so the actual production of actual, things that you need to renew, to utilize in society, like they're vitally important, right? So when you produce those types of wealth and you produce wealth in general, productive labor, then you have more control over the society overall, to then when you decide to not do something, then it becomes a lot more forceful, and your control over that particular section allows you to then be able to control society overall a lot more too as well. Because let me just give an example, right? So if you're producing a lot of food, right, and employees and the proletarians are in control of a lot of the food production, right, within a society, then it becomes a lot more difficult for capitalists to basically say, let's cut off the food supply. Or then on the reverse side, then if workers want to cut off, food supply in order to force, some type of protest or something like that, or some type of revolutionary, movement or something like around like a strike, right? A general strike. If you control the productive labor, that gives you on both sides, right? So you can control the productive labor such that you can keep society sustained through a revolution, and you control productive forces such that that you can cut off productive forces in order to have a strike or to force some type of movement, right? And that's different for service sector things, because sometimes that could just be a convenience thing, right? So I mean, and that I mean, in our current society, that could be sort of a big deal, but it could sort of not be as well, right? Because of how divided up it is, across, and but like I mean, you think a certain, I mean, certain ones are going to be greater than others. That's basically what I'm saying, right? Because if Walmart, is one of the largest employers, which we'll get to a little bit later, if all Walmart employees just decide not to show up to work, it could just become an inconvenience because in areas there's probably other places to get food. There's probably other places to to buy things, right? And in general, like it's just going to be inconvenience. Like think of Starbucks workers would probably be a greater example. If all Starbucks workers just decided not to participate in anymore, like it basically becomes an issue where people will have to make their own coffee. And that's kind of what you're getting at. Versus if you control the actual production. And also another thing is if Walmart employees just quit working, it's not like things quit getting shipped to Walmart. It's not like things are quit going into Walmart, right? And obviously, with Walmart being a huge union busting corporation, because this is obviously unrealistic in the first place, because of Walmart's ability to be able to control unionizing and be able to control their employees and be able to, if people do start unionizing and get rid of them, if people have a propensity or show a propensity when they sign up for the job of unionizing or particular class politics, then they could weed those people out even before they get the job, right? But just like even if they did get into it, I mean, obviously you could fire those people, you could try to hire new people because you have a high reserve labor army. So there's complications such as that as well. But then obviously, once the people, actually inside actually decide not to do it, the infrastructure still exists such that things are actually being produced, right? So nothing in the Walmart that actually provides, food or, clothing or any of this other stuff quits being produced. It's still being produced. So for one, there's other outlets to be able to distribute those things, like I mentioned earlier. And I mean, obviously, worst comes to worst, people could just go into the store and steal it, or go into the store and self checkout, right? So I mean, in automation, for example, like Walmart could just decide if all the Walmart employees just quit, the Walmart could just have a particular managerial class just come in and just facilitate everything through automation, right, or online. I mean, distribution. I mean, obviously they're getting into self, whatever cars and stuff now. I mean, obviously they could outsource, the delivery systems, to like another delivery service. And there's so many different things you could do that if you actually control the production, then it becomes a little bit more difficult, right? And then obviously the people at Walmart not controlling production, if they decided like we're just going to provide free stuff for people, right? We're just going to take over Walmart and we're just going to start providing, a communistic, experience and start, allowing people to come in and poor people will come in and giving away stuff. And, if obviously don't control the production, then if the capitalists saw it happening, they just cut off the production to Walmart, right? Right. To cut off the flow of certain products, right? So, I mean, it becomes sort of complicated when you don't have actual productive, capital as far as, a proletariat without even getting into then the ideological framework, which I'm going to get into in a minute about the people actually being like, in poverty and having a revolutionary and not a bourgeois framework from the beginning. So, about 16 million are self-employed. Obviously, this is going to be, people self-employed. If it's a large percentage of self-employed, you're going to have people more likely to have a petty bourgeois attitude, obviously. Millennials are now the largest. Okay. And then let me get on to the next, because this one was a little bit less important. Okay, the largest employers per. So, and largest employers. And this is a point that I want to make. Obviously, I already talked about the productive labor versus, so you can see Walmart just dominates, right? Which I just got into discussing. But then what also dominates healthcare and then the public sector, which healthcare sort of would be public sector if we actually had public healthcare, like kind of normal people, but we obviously don't. And obviously you see stuff like Boeing and stuff like that. So you obviously that's sort of the same kind of deal, right? They sort of work as like an extension of the government type of deal, right? Kind of Boeing and NASA kind of to like the aerospace type, right? So they sort of operate like that. So basically you have public sector, people who work directly for the government, and then people who work basically mostly in service sector. And as you know, I go through this, you'll see obviously that trend continuing. U.S. labor force statistics. I don't really care about the women in the labor force. I mean, like, there probably could be points to be made about women in the labor force. Like obviously, the point that Marx made as far as why, obviously if you could split household incomes, right? So if you could split household incomes, but then so you can maintain the same household income, but then gain more employees, right? So say you had four people live in a house, like two adults, two children, right? If you could split that up and say it's $100,000 house income, if you could split it up between husband and wife making $50,000 versus the husband just making $100,000, now you have for one, you could destroy the family a little bit, right? Because you could have the wife not be able to give as much time towards the household, her full time towards the household, right? But she has her individual income. So if you could drop the husband's income down and then get the wife, you used to get two employees. Now destroy the family a little bit, while also not having to pay any more money because their household income is still the same. So money coming in wise, they're still feeling pretty, on the same level, right, of income, household income. So, you could do things like that. And obviously they used to have child labor, so you could add in the children too. So during Marx's time, they discussed that, right? So you could divide it up even into like 25, 25, 25, 25, and have all of them coming into work. And then you still have a household income of say 100,000, which obviously that's unrealistic, number for particular times. But obviously just for like an easy example, we'll be able to understand why you expand the labor force. And obviously expanding the labor force expands the reserve labor army too, right? So you now have more employees to be able to discipline workers with, right? So now we could, if the workers start acting up, you could have like if male workers start, becoming too, combative and start becoming too revolutionary and start forming into like more militant groups, right, and violent groups, then obviously you could just have more women come into work and try to replace them. And if the women don't follow the same ideological framework that the men were following, then you can obviously have an issue there. And regardless, even if you just say a specific percentage of men and specific percentage of women that are less revolutionary, you could obviously throw the people who are more revolutionary into the reserve labor, into the unemployed or self-employed or whatever else, and then you could bring in the workers who are more obedient to capital, right? Because you have a higher amount to be able to play with. If you have a lower amount to be able to play with, then their ability to unionize is going to be higher. Their ability to become more revolutionary and try to control is going to become a lot higher because they're going to be able to have more close relationships. Less people flowing in and out. So I mean, there's that obviously. But ignoring that for a second, let's go into this right here. Occupation of labor force. So in this, I accidentally hit one of the. Let me scroll back up. So here we go. This is divided by race and U.S. labor force, but that kind of doesn't matter. The main part that I want to deal with right now is look at the sales and office and service, management and professional related. Okay, you see this is your huge chunk, right? Sales and office, service, management and professional related versus national resource construction and maintenance and production transforming and material moving, right? So these are your productive capitalist framework, right? And you have roughly about, let's just say 20% higher for Latinos, over about 30, and Hispanics, it's a little bit higher, around about a little bit over 30, and then for everybody else, it's a little bit over 20. And that's even, I don't know if this is actually, well, actually it does say management, so it could be saying that specific workers within this are not within management, but within those industries, right? But I'm not sure how that's actually to be divided up, and it really doesn't matter because it's already pretty low, and that's my major point here, right? So as far as productive capital, you're already talking about 20%, and then out of those 20%, it doesn't mean that every single person who works within these industries has a proletarian background ideologically, right? Okay, so it doesn't mean that they're not reactionaries in a particular sense, and they weren't, And that's why the video, if I have to do another video on controlled opposition, why that matters, right? Because you could take a person who is part of this particular productive capitalist, productive labor force, and make them follow a capitalistic mindset. You could also, it doesn't say anything about how much these people are being paid, right? And we'll get into that in a second. But yeah, but this is obviously, if you're talking about 40, 60, plus percent, and then service, adding another. So you're basically talking almost an 80-20 divide, give or take, between people who are in these type of managerial positions and sales service positions. And even if you added the service sector in, then you're at what, 20, 30. So you're still a majority, even if you just take management, professional related, and then sales. And obviously, if you split these up, split into different categories, the management one is still the biggest. For everybody, it looks like, except, yeah, for everybody. Well, everybody except Hispanic and Latino, which is a little bit higher for service than management positions. But for everybody else, it's higher significantly, even against service sector. Okay. Number of people in workforce. Okay. COVID, I don't really care about the COVID. The education thing might come up in a second, but I'm not going to deal with that now. And here's just a bigger chart of it, divided up. Obviously, education is a big one. Healthcare is a big one. And all the people who work within these industries, not all of them, but in general, they produce a particular kind of ideological framework to work in those type of industries, particularly healthcare. You have to make a lot of acceptance of particular frameworks of Western health and medicine, as we saw with COVID, right? So what you had a lot of people in the healthcare industry, and you saw the ability of capital to be able to discipline this as well when they didn't, right? So you saw particular doctors who didn't abide by COVID protocols and started trying to step outside of the box a little bit, lose fired and lose their jobs. You saw people who didn't want to get vaccinated have to quit their jobs in healthcare industries. Obviously in education as well. You saw people who wanted to push back against particular ideological frameworks get disciplined. So even their ability to discipline people who step outside of particular, obviously this has been the case for Marxists. As much as the right wing wants to say that colleges and universities are just filled with Marxists, this is absolutely crazy. Because there are basically no Marxists who have major roles in a lot of universities and stuff like that. So especially major roles, basically non-existent. And then obviously you could get into the racial aspect of that as well. But let me go ahead and go to, here's the chart of it. So you could see retail, trade, transportation, warehouse is even pretty low. Professional and scientific is pretty high. And healthcare is a gigantic chunk. Healthcare, which we always know that. And then obviously service sector is right here. Other services. So you can see service, healthcare, education, administration, and managerial makes up to like a large chunk. And then obviously they got things like the manufacturer and construction and stuff making up a little smaller chunk. And it kind of splits it a little bit, right? Kind of splits it around. But obviously you can see it almost from here to around all the way over to around here, including some of this is these particular labor categories. And this is not necessarily an issue overall, but once you get into the income splits, you'll see that because obviously if all these people were just dirt poor and barely making by, and we're in these industries and we're kind of like revolutionized by that would be different. But a lot of times you get a lot of younger people in these positions, and like I said, in particular ones, education, administration, obviously, but even like the service sector, you could primarily just use young people. That's another thing I could bring up right now. For the service sector, another thing you could do is, even if the people are revolutionary, you could just bring in younger people and people who aren't going to stay there long term, right? So you could your managerial class within that, you could pick people who aren't very revolutionary by their nature, and then for the youth, right, who are always potentially revolutionary, the youth college kids are always going to be one of the highest revolutionaries because they have the time, they have, the youthful mindset, aspirational mindset. And, if where you can't discipline them through debt, obviously is a good way to discipline them, the cost of college, right? Where you can't always completely discipline them, you could get them to, get them in and out, right? So college is pretty short. By the time they're in their 30s or something like that, definitely, should be out of that. And then, and that's even, people who do it a long time. I mean, if you just talk about just an undergraduate degree or an associate's degree, then you're out a lot quicker than that. You're 20s. So, get people in and out of that, and then you can get people in and out of working, service sector type jobs, right? So the Starbucks worker thing, like you might be like 20 working at Starbucks, you're moving on, right? You're moving on, you're getting a better job. Same thing with people who work at like, Walmart and stuff like that. You can get people in and out of there, right? So you work at Walmart for a couple of years and then you find a better job, maybe even a union type job, or if it's not union, maybe something that just has particular, health benefits and higher wages, et cetera, and then you're out of there, right? So that's another factor. I'm gonna go ahead and close these other tabs. I don't need these other tabs open anymore. So this is labor force characteristics by race and ethnicity. And this is going to become important. I'll discuss this because if you look at what I said earlier about how the nature of the composition of the labor force, which is discussing here, changed over time, right? And how capitalism was able to mold it into something more desirable for their benefits, right? In comparison to, say, during the 1930s, when you had what would they call it, the labor movement during the 1930s, like the communist movements that during like FDR's time, where they were really, kind of at a heightened contradiction standpoint from just maybe potentially going after it all. How that was be able to adjust it down into expanding the middle class and the New Deal and stuff like that, right? Well, one of the things that remained consistent throughout this was white supremacy, and you don't have to be honest about that. During this period, a lot more people who were previously looked down upon were able to enter whiteness over time, especially after the Civil Rights Movement. After the Civil Rights Movement, especially, you saw Asian groups be able to enter, and non-native black groups like immigrant groups be able to enter even. And you can see this. I don't think I got this chart up here, but there's one statistics that you could actually look at Asian incomes like post 1970s. And you could see Asians went from almost the lowest to the highest income over this time, right? Because you just bring in more immigrants. And obviously, the immigrants that you bring in, you could bring in people from higher classes. You could bring in people who already have degrees or who want to pursue higher education degrees, and that's going to adjust their incomes up, obviously. And obviously, you're not bringing in Chinese communists who are trying to infiltrate. You're not bringing in, people from Asian, like North Korea and stuff like that, who are trying to infiltrate and spread, communism in the United States. You're bringing in people who want to be a part of and are bourgeois aspirational, right? And that's how you could get this, because they're more bourgeois aspirational. They're not more revolutionary. So, and then one thing, like I said, and obviously you have the Italians, you have the Irish, you have Jewish people. And what is consistent throughout this is that black people were consistently not allowed to access this, which makes them potentially a more revolutionary group. But, I mean, also, it's just a straight fact at the beginning of the country, the lowest class, people use the term second class citizens throughout, the 20th century, but the lowest class was, the enslaved Africans, right? And if you look at some of this data, obviously that's one thing that's going to pop out throughout the data. And this is educational attainment. As you could see, blacks and Latinos have the lowest in terms of bachelor degrees by a reasonable amount. And so if you look at black Americans, for example, I think this it says African American is cut off a little bit. So if you look from, college educated, some college downward, right? You can see this is the majority versus with white, it's the opposite. So you have associate's degree, 41, and obviously this is over 50%, so over half. And if we go, and for the Latino thing, what you have to keep in mind here is probably that a lot of these people are immigrants. So if you immigrant to the United States, and obviously, like I said, with Asians, the difference probably would be that, like I said, the Asian groups, you can come, yeah, people can come here with a specific intent of this, versus with Latinos, you might get a lot more people who or uh, or who come here and already have a degree, I should say, as well. And versus Latinos, you get a lot more poor individuals coming here who might not already have degrees, and then obviously that's going to be an effect as well. I'm not necessarily sure why, but I'm assuming that has something to do with it. And then for occupation, and this is just a distribution of, so you can see managerial positions. You can see how much more white and Asian managerial positions there are than African American and Latino and Hispanic. We're talking a pretty reasonable amount difference, 55% and 41% to 30 and 20. So, or I guess 31 and 23. And then obviously it's the same exists basically throughout. If you look at the overall, and then obviously at the bottom, you have obviously more of the productive force. And this kind of matters too, right? The more of the productive force, and within this is coming from these Hispanic and Black. And obviously after slavery, because obviously during slavery, the bulk of the, production in those fields, in the South, for example, were done here, and then they started to be done by a lot of migrant workers, right? So you have migrant labor, somewhat being able to fill in obviously what wasn't exported to other countries and stuff like that. So obviously there's that. Unemployment, obviously you have higher percentages. And earnings, which we'll get into next. I don't know what other charts I have here. Here's just the one that's straight up distribution of work force. Straight up shows the service versus industry and agriculture, which obviously you can see the big numbers here of just the straight distribution instead of broken down into categories. Obviously, you're dealing with a huge section of, like I said, it was about 80-20. That's what I said earlier. And that's significant. Okay, and here's just the expanded version of it again. And you could just read these off if you want to come to these sites and view the data. And here is one. This is the same visualization, 150 years of U.S. employment history. Visual capitalist. Here we go. And here you could see, and this is a big deal, over time, you could see this agricultural to briefly manufacturing to now lower and all into retail, and obviously increase in health, education, professional services, government, right? See this? And that's very important, because even if you look at other countries that were able to develop socialistic forces within a global scale, a lot of the, when they were able to take over, were during times like this, right? The early 20th century, when you still had, you could see when it starts to break down, right? In the early 20th century, right? That's when you could start see, fluctuates a little bit. Then, manufacturing goes up significantly, and then it cut off during the, I guess what you consider like the financialization of the economy and deindustrialization, and it starts going down again. But the agricultural thing is because the peasants, I guess what you call them, peasants and farmers, can play a role in revolutionary situations, right? If you eliminate that class of people and then basically put everybody into the industrial framework, but then, you kind of then move the industrialized framework away and deindustrialize, then you got a lot of people who go from, I guess, what you consider even proletariat. Then some people start going into the lumpen proletariat, but that's another discussion as well, as far as class analysis of the particular different classes, and what now within our framework, what does proletariat, what does lumpen proletariat, what does bourgeois mean within our current today context versus what it could have meant back in Marxist times, right? Because you can see this is Marxist times, right? 1850. You could see the breakdown of the United States specifically during this time is completely different. The labor force is completely different. So trying to apply that 1850 framework, it's not only not going to apply, but you have to completely reevaluate the situation and basically give a 21st century class analysis. You have to just you can't totally toss it. You have to use some of the frameworks that obviously the analysis of capitalism still stands, right? But the class analysis is different because the class relationships is completely different. And obviously during this time, you also have aristocracy being an issue. And even if you want to look at slavery in the United States, what did slavery represent in the United States? It represented a makeshift feudalism and a makeshift aristocracy. The slave owners basically became landed aristocracy. They basically become the equivalent of landed aristocracy in Europe, European aristocratic frameworks in the United States. And that's why they had to be challenged, just like the aristocrats had to be challenged by the bourgeoisie in Europe to gain power, and so the bourgeois could start entering ruling class frameworks. They had to be challenged in the United States. That's what the Civil War was about, right? The Civil War was basically another extension of a bourgeois revolution that started with the first, what you could call a civil war. It was the American Revolution, which was basically a civil war because it was a war against basically English settlers for the most part in England. So it wasn't a war between indigenous, so it wasn't a true liberatory revolutionary war. It was a war between basically who out of the bourgeoisie landed aristocracy in the U.S. versus the bourgeoisie and aristocracy in England, who got control over particular access to the resources and government and stuff like that. Who got basically the power control, and then obviously that power dynamic shifted again in the 50s and 60s with the Civil War era, and during Reconstruction, where that shifted back to the bourgeoisie, and then obviously after that's when you had the Second Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, where industrialists started coming more and more to prominence and power, started taking more control over government, and then eventually during the height of this contradiction is when you had eventually what was the Great Depression and the New Deal, which still going in expansion of the ruling class. And that's where we're going to get into talking about once you get to the issue with, once you get through the issue with the incomes, because you could see that the middle class expanded. And one thing you're going to realize too, I guess I can make this point now, I might have to make it again later on, but when you have the expansion of the middle class and the contraction of the middle class, you could see how that controls attitudes, right? So when the middle class was at its lowest and poverty was at its highest, that's where you had a lot of heightened tension. But then when the New Deal happened and a lot of more middle class wealth started getting built, and you had a period of time where it felt like, outside of the civil rights, black liberation movements, and a lot of younger people who were communists and socialists and stuff like that, it felt like a more stable capitalistic relationship until deindustrialization. And then you started getting the middle class dropping off. And once the middle class started getting squeezed again is when you had a resurgence of socialism and Bernie Sanders, like in 2016. I guess it culminated in that. Obama was a little bit holding off of that, but the Occupy Wall Street obviously happened during Obama. But once you had that middle class being squeezed, a lot of those people, the resentment in the middle class started, shaping. And that's why it's very important to have a class analysis, because you understand that once those people with middle class lifestyles were starting to be challenged a little bit because how high college costs were becoming, how high college debt was becoming, how low it was becoming in terms of opportunity once they exited college to have a job that was going to be able to pay off that debt. Once those type of promises of American dreams started getting squeezed a little bit, then you started having a lot more people ideologically becoming like, oh, we're Marxists now, we're socialists now. A new generation of younger people with completely different frameworks, but they're coming from bourgeois, previously bourgeois attitudes. A lot of them coming from middle class. They're not coming from poverty into Marxism. They're not coming from the proletariat into Marxism. They're coming from bourgeois backgrounds because of the squeeze that was happening because of the economic downturn, right? Just like, the economic downturns that existed at the beginning of the 20th century. And capital is always better able to and that's why I said I'm going to have to do the one on controlled opposition, because during this time, what also did you have? You had Nazism, you had fascism in Europe and in the United States, and then at the same time, you then had FDR, right? And you had that type of bourgeois socialism that existed during that time, right? So it's from both ends. And then what did you have in 2016? You had Trump and you had Bernie Sanders, right? See, capitalism, I mean, to say history repeats, first time as a tragedy and as a farce is kind of funny. It's not, I mean, obviously it's just kind of like a joking type thing to say. But obviously, if it's broke, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just keep going on with the same thing that works. And if every time that there's a tension within society, capitalists could just throw out a far right alternative and a bourgeois fake pseudo leftist alternative, and it just eats everything up, and it always works. Just do it every single time. Just keep going. Just keep sending Stephen Curry to shoot a deep three and just splash every time until someone comes out and guards it or does something about it, and then we'll drive, and do something else, right? But I mean, it works every single time. The controlled opposition works every single time. It doesn't fail. And then they're more advanced, obviously, with ideological manipulation too. So I don't know if I want to do this side. I guess I can. Basically, this is what I was describing earlier. So what you had at the beginning of colonization was the use of enslaved Africans to expand the productive wealth in wealth production within the quote unquote New World, the Americas, for the British core, British and obviously Spanish and stuff at that time, but the British Empire ended up becoming the large empire of this time. And as time went on, the original framing of colonization of the Asia, Africa, the Americas by European powers, and the framing of Africans in America as the low class, as the enslaved class, and then as under Jim Crow, and then as under mass incarceration, and all the rates and disparities, and subject to genocide. You saw this, for people who are in colonial regions, Africa, South America, whatever regions that's affected by imperialism. And what do you see, right? You see the areas affected by the colonialism be the ones that have the revolutionary moments more often than not. And you see, obviously, in the America, the people who are affected by the colonialism are, the indigenous and, black populations. So that's something just to keep in mind. And what was consistent throughout this, as the proletarian wage labor class dynamic shifted, it was through whiteness, through middle class ness, basically. But what remained was black people at the bottom consistently, right? And obviously, this has to do with the changing of the definition of race over time. So this has to do with becoming white. If you want to go look at this on my website, defining racism, white supremacy, and the historical development. I don't know how good it is. I mean, I wrote that a while ago. You see, 2020. I don't know how much still stands as far as how I advanced my position since then. And obviously statistics on Black lives and immigration. This is good to see because you could see, what they did in trying to get rid of Black people as a percentage of the population because of their revolutionary potential. Because they have the highest, or I guess we Black people had the highest like contradiction between their position in society and capitalism and white supremacy being the dominant ideological relationship. Like it's directly opposed, right? So there's no like reforming. There's no reforming slavery, right? There's no reforming slavery. So if you're directly like defined as enslaved, um, you know, lower class, like the only thing you could do is destroy the system. There's no other like alternative thing that you could try. But I mean, like, who wants to be, just a better off slave? Nobody, right? When you think about it. So when it's defined as such, and that's the relationship that exists, that's the social relationship that exists. The only thing that you could do is destroy the system. And if you have that potential, and this is what they knew at the time, right? You could come read some of this. This is what Du Bois pointed out. Some of this is quotes from Du Bois. Some of it's just statistics from the time period. But this would be statistics on Black lives and immigration. My website's theeliatic.com, which it should be like linked on the YouTube page. But basically, let me get back to the point. So yeah, so there was a conscious effort, and you can read through this. You can read through like the suppression of the slave trade. Du Bois talks about some of this. There was a conscious effort, and this is populations of the original 13 colonies. You could see the particular colonies that try to get rid of slavery, try to lower the percentage of black populations, and to bring in white immigrants to replace them, who they could then filter through like a bourgeois ideological. And then over time, that ended up expanding to whiteness overall, expansion of whiteness overall, and a displacement of class. And you could see obviously, and this obviously had direct ties to industrial revolution and bourgeois revolution within the U.S. because obviously you could see during here's I think this is the Irish potato. You can see Ireland. I don't know if you can see this. Okay, so you can see this is Ireland in the green. This I think it's the potato famine. But then obviously once you get to the 60s, 1860s, where you have the Civil War, that's when it starts going up, and then early 20th century industrialization up, and then it gets cut off at a certain point when they stop letting immigrants in. But then obviously after 1980, it goes up again, and then you start getting people from Mexico, because that's when Jim Crow ended. This is around the time when this is very important for labor analysis, because this is a time where sharecropping and because convict leasing, you had after this you still had convict leasing, you still had sharecropping, you still had in the South specifically, you had tenant, like wage type tenant, well not even wage, but like tenant farming basically in the South. So there's basically just different types of sharecropping and different types of peonage. That's the word I'm looking for. Debt peonage as well, right? So you had this peonage and stuff like that in the South during this entire time. And even after slavery, this like what they call slavery by another name, or neo-feudalism, neo-slavery, whatever you want to call it, still existed in the South. And at some points in time, it was just slavery. They just called it, sharecropping or peonage. But I mean, obviously, depending on how they wanted it to be framed, because peonage was technically illegal when they still did it. That's why I think the conversation around the 13th Amendment is just stupid, where people say that like it's a loophole. What they need a loophole for? They didn't care. Like, they didn't care about enslaving black people. Why the heck did they care they didn't care what the law was? They just said black people weren't human and enslaved, and they didn't care what the law said. They didn't really care. So if they don't care what the laws are, and what the heck do they care what the laws are about peonies? They had debt. They were practicing debt peonies when debt peonies was explicitly against the law. So that was explicitly against the law, and that's one of the major things that they were practicing. So if that's what one of the major things they were practicing against the law, what the heck did they need a loophole in the 13th Amendment for? They didn't. They didn't care. They would have just had slaves. And also, the 13th Amendment didn't really have any enforcement power anyway. They didn't really care. What was the federal government going to do? Come down and stop slavery? Again, I mean, they already withdrew, from the South after during Reconstruction, after the Compromise of 1876-77, right? So they already withdrew from the South. They already showed no interest in fighting against white supremacy in the South throughout the entire period of Jim Crow. So why the heck would they care if they had slaves or not? They wouldn't. So I mean, it didn't have to. Just have to be convict leasing. Convict leasing was just another way they could criminalize black people and just take them, and do whatever. That was just another strategy. But I mean, that was just additional strategies to many of the ones that they already had. So, looking at this, obviously you could see during this period of time is when, because I forget exactly when, but it's like the the 10s, 20s, 30s, you start seeing convict leasing become more illegal. Peonage start getting cut off a little bit more, and then you start seeing at a certain point sharecropping starts becoming a little bit less and less and less over time. More black people start moving out, mass migrating out of the South into the cities in the North during industrialization up until the 1950s and 60s to California, so, obviously New York to Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Detroit, all of it, right? And then obviously after that period, you start getting a lot more people immigrate from Mexico because now you can replace some of the that type of labor with migrant workers, right? So some of that type of labor you can replace with migrant workers in farming and stuff like that. So that's the point that could be made about that, about the development of the workforce and the maintenance of white supremacy throughout that. You can see a list of ethnic groups in the United States. Okay, now we're gonna get into the incomes. That's what I was said we were going to get into. So we'll get into this. Hopefully I go through this quickly. Asian Americans. Okay, population, median household incomes. So this is distributed by income. You can obviously see how low Black Americans are on this income. 43 in comparison to white Americans. And if you go down through, what you'll see is detailed ancestry. I mean, Black Americans basically fall off the list. You know what I mean? 40, what does it say? It was a 43 or 41? 43 and 43 below that. 107 ethnic groups. So, I mean, that's an important factor to keep in mind. Obviously, based on what I just said. And here is one of the main things I want to address, which is percentage distribution of household income. Because now we're talking about poverty, right? And let me see if I got my poverty charts. So the rest of this stuff should be wealth gap. Let me go ahead and I'll show the wealth gap when, let me see, what's this one? Household income again. Okay, poverty, okay. So here's this is just wealth gap between white, Black, Hispanic families. And obviously, people have seen the wealth data before, and you could obviously go through every percentage category. You could obviously there's high distribution of wealth inequality. Like if you go through each, so like for example, I don't know if I have the chart here. At each specific level. I probably have it on my Facebook page or something. I could try to look it up real quick on my Facebook. Okay, here it is. Let me see. Open a new tab. Okay, so what you'll see here is besides the median net worth by household income percentile, right? So if you break it down into income percentiles, which obviously is somewhat of an indication of wealth, income. There's some correlation there. Obviously, you could have high income, and that's one of the major points of pointing out the the gap between Black and white wealth in general, as you see here, and as you can see in these charts, the percentage of white wealth in comparison, home income and stuff like that, stocks and all that other stuff. If you want to look that up, the wealth gap. But one thing to point out is that when you look at wealth and income, is if you look at it, broken down, you see the top 10%. You can see how low Black people are, even in comparison within percentiles, right? All the way down to the bottom 20th percent, right? And when you see basically the people at the bottom, then you finally see white people level out, and this obviously you can see at every level there's a gap. So the wealth gap doesn't just exist from the top percent, because some people try to make that point sometimes, like, oh well, and obviously this group of people has tons more, and obviously there is a wealth gap, obviously between the Blacks in the top percentile versus in the lower, but the wealth gap between white and Black exists at every level of income. And also, given wealth disparities exist in general, and Black people tend to have less wealth, when you do have higher incomes, what ends up happening is that if you break free of the cycle of poverty, look at NBA players. Well, how do NBA players, when you go quote unquote NBA players going broke? Well, they go broke because everybody around them that they know growing up with were all poor. So if you give money to your mom, but I mean, if you come from a rich family, a wealthy family, your family already has houses, they already have cars, they already have wealth, they already have educations, they already have high incomes because of their jobs, social capital. So if you already have that social capital exists, you have the access to the bourgeoisie, you have access to the middle class assets, and middle class wealth. That is very, very important from a class analysis, because then even when you do have higher incomes, you can show how someone with a higher income doesn't necessarily have a higher class disposition and background. But that's not to say that there's not a black bourgeoisie or boule class that does exist to have had some wealth. It's just when they do exist, they have less wealth than their white counterparts. Okay. And then and what you'll see here is this is very important because this is a distribution. And what you could see, we'll just go to 2020 because that's where we're at. Let me go and blow this up because this is kind of small. One more. Okay. So what you'll see here is we'll just do 2020. Okay. Under 15%. So under 15%. Under 15,000 is only around 10%. That's the poverty line, right? Close to the poverty line. So the poverty level would be maybe a little bit above that, or a little, I think. But because I think the poverty line might be a little bit different than that. So it should be a little bit different than that number, but that's close enough, right? So around 10%, let's say, is the poverty line. So only 10% of the population is poor. Only 10% of the population is the lowest. And then even if you add up, let's just say everybody making under 35, and obviously this is going to differ per like location, right? So obviously making 15 in the country versus that in a major city is going to be different. That's why I said black people could be different, right? Because if you're working a minimum wage job in like outside like a particular city area where things could be more expensive, and moving up within the relation to things could be more expensive, owning a house is more expensive, etc., then that lower income is going to matter, even up to like at 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, 70, 80,000, depending on how much the cost of living in that particular area is. But then obviously, on the flip side, from particular perspective, being in those particular areas gives you more access to, if you do have social mobility, which black people tend to have less of, but if you do have more social mobility, social capital, you do have more access to resources in areas that have more access to resources, relationships with other people, etc., etc. So, but just in general, like if you look at it, you're looking at 10% over 200,000. So you're talking about 18%. And then, by the time you get to, it looks like around like over 100,000, or at least over like 50,000, you're talking a majority of the population. So looking at the bottom percent, let's just say even if it's 30%, to make it below 30, 35,000 or so, even if we take that as 30%, you're still, majority of the population is making incomes that are high enough to, I would say, put them in the middle class. And then we're talking about poverty, very low percentage. And why is this important? Obviously, because proletarian technically means the lowest poor class. And those used to be, my point in this video, used to be the workers. They used to be the class of people who were serving as the army of laborers for working, like the working class. The working class was the proletariat. The working class was the proletariat. It was the poor. It was the impoverished who were then, and that's why the lumpen proletariat thing kind of shifts, because the large group of people who had access to working were poor. People who actually had jobs were poor. That's why unionizing, I said, would have been more important at that point in time than it became later, right? And that's very important for the class analysis. And obviously, when you talk numbers, when you talk percentage of the population in the West specifically, when you look at poverty, you're talking a very, 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 very low percentage of people you actually have access to communicating to in order to try to overthrow this society. Because the people with the highest contradiction that exists are very low percentage. People who live in poverty are very low percentage in comparison to the overall population. So what you get, like I mentioned earlier, is you get people who are being squeezed out of the middle class, trying to represent themselves as if they were proletarians, as if they were poor, as if they were impoverished, as if they were, the true quote unquote working class. And they try to this working class expansionism, and that's where people get the label reductionism, because obviously you can see obviously between black people and white people that these numbers are completely different. Like it doubles with black people, so you have double obviously out of poverty, and then obviously this one's not by race, is it? No, this one was. So obviously, if you look at the income distribution right now, like I said, it doubles it. So now instead of white, Hispanic, white alone, not Hispanic, and then black, you already doubled the poverty rate, and then you still have more all the way up to like 50,000, or actually all the way up to 75,000. So the bottom concentration of the poor has a black majority. To get majority, you have less way to go, versus with the white population you have more of a way to go before you get majorities on the other side, I guess I should say. So that's very important to keep in mind, and that's why the actually accusations of class reductionism become important, because it's not just reducing things to class. It's that class can't be reduced to class like that. You're reducing people into a particular class that aren't necessarily in the particular class. And like I said, then when you talk about ideology, that becomes completely different, right? Because you could technically have a person who's in poverty, and this is not as, if you listen to certain Democratic talking points or Republican, not Republican talking points, but basically Democratic talking points talking about poor people vote for Trump, people in this particular category of in the 7%, 8%. Who live, or even double that, like within this 20 percentile, let's say, the bottom 20 percentile of income distribution, aren't really voting for Republicans like that, bro. They understand their class relationship. It's mainly people in this section and up that are voting for Republicans, including Trump. This didn't magically change. But are there poor people in this category that do vote for Trump and can be even just in general anti-communist and stuff like that, like kind of with their disposition because of indoctrination over time and stuff like that? Yes, and that's the point. You can indoctrinate, but obviously what capitalists are able to understand is you can target different people with different things, right? So the people who you could target to be more anti-communist are people who have something to lose. And that's why if you redistribute, which they did over the 20th century, some of this wealth back to the bottom percent, as long as you can create a middle class, then obviously you could create people who can then reinforce the ideology within themselves and then overall within society. And that's very important. And like I said, if you're going back to this, you can see, the numbers speak for themselves. I don't really have to sit here and keep explaining that obviously you don't have the numbers technically from the standpoint of a proletarian, and a proletarian doesn't necessarily equal working class within our current day arrangement. And same thing with lumpen proletarian. It's just completely different class dynamics than existed before. And the last thing that this is the poverty rate. That's what I was talking about, how it doubles basically. The U.S. poverty was a little bit higher for blacks. It's a little bit so it doubles. I don't know what this statistic. Okay, this was from recently. And here's what I want to get to last. Examining, okay, that's the wealth gap thing. By our current definition of poverty, 56% families were poor in 1900. 56%. That was before the Great Depression. So here's the basically what would be an estimate of poverty over the 20th century. This has to be an estimate because I think it was in 40s. I think it's around 47 or something where they actually implemented like a poverty line and rate or whatever. It was like in the 40s or 50s before they actually did that. Maybe it was in 50. I think 56 when it looks like maybe when they started it again and then kept it going. So in the 50s basically, or the early 60s, you have these statistics. But before that, they didn't really have any real statistics. Well, they had statistics probably on it, but not like the federal government was keeping detailed like they do now. So here's actual and here's predicted, and you can see between the beginning of the 20th century and the Great Depression, it fluctuates between 50% of the population poor. Okay, so what's basically 10% now was 50 to almost 80%, or I don't know if this is above 80 or where it is around 80. This is the point of the video. This is it. We're going to end right here because this is the point that needs to be made. When you change the dynamics of class such that back then, and a lot of these people were agricultural workers too, that like obviously agricultural workers can shift as well, just like people within like the lower part of the bourgeoisie can. So that analysis has to be shifted, obviously, because obviously the ideological framework and stuff that you're dealing with when you're dealing with farmers and agricultural workers or people who's like self-sustaining laborers is obviously completely different. Because in other countries where you had that, they tended to be the revolutions tended to be able to happen in those countries, like when you saw in China, what you saw in Russia, what you saw in like South America at different varying times, in Africa. Those countries and the colonialism matter too, right? Those countries were able to develop socialism, and the ruling classes were weaker. See, and the amount of resources they were able to exploit from other countries, obviously they couldn't, because obviously the imperialist power was in Europe. They were the ones that were able to exploit, the majority of resources and labor and everything else, and there was slavery and everything else. So over time, they were able, starting in around the New Deal time, around the Great Depression, New Deal, World War II, were able to get this to start going down. And then going down, 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 down. And then by the 50s and 60s, and since today, they were able to get it a lot lower. But, obviously for black people, it's a little bit higher. But the main point is, look, we don't have this anymore. The proletariat is no longer like a large chunk of impoverished, people coming off of farms and agricultural. It's forced into cities to, work in industry. Where there's this heightened contradiction between the wage labor force and the capitalist industrialized capitalist productive capital, that just completely vanished. As incomes as a middle class was created, and once the middle class was created, all these people who were once poor, not all of them, but a great percentage of them, as you can see, were allowed to enter the middle class. Before, at one point in time, then you had like 50% maybe of the population and above that were actually middle class. And actually, I do have that. I'll go ahead and show that. I said this was going to be the last thing I show, but I might as well just show the one on the middle class of the percentage, because that's basically the bourgeois It's a bourgeois calculator. Let's call this the bourgeois calculator from Pew. Are you the American middle class? Are you bourgeois? Find out with your income calculator, and you can put in your state and metro area. But overall, adults in each income tier, middle, upper. So for upper, you have 50%. So we're just going to say with 30, they give a little bit better estimate. So let's just say, well, this is the estimate. So 30%. So you have 50, and then 20. So basically, it's a little bit above 70% right here. Versus 30. So you're a 70-30 split, basically. Middle and upper. So this would be like the petty bourgeoisie, and this would be the ruling class bourgeoisie. Well, actually a smaller percentage of this would be ruling class, because even a smaller percentage of that would be ruling class. So this would be like ruling class bourgeoisie, high bourgeoisie, and then low bourgeoisie, and then proletarian, lower class. And then obviously some of these people don't even have jobs. So some of them are unemployed. So some of them are not even in the labor force. Some of these people could be freaking incarcerated. And that's why they lump in proletariat analysis trying to change this. So there you go. We'll end on this. Middle class, middle income. And obviously this was squeezed down over time. So I mean, I'll basically say, that's the end of the video. Basically look out for part 4 maybe. Or I might move on to discuss either Pan-Africanism or a different topic, because I have videos on Pan-Africanism that could be next. But I'm not necessarily sure what I want to do as far as the next video. So that's it.